there, and welcome to this edition of Inside the Vault, episode number 38. I'm your host, Ryan Smith. Welcome to another episode here where this episode is going to be a little bit of a schedule release, post-draft, and kind of all big picture things here in the Carolina Panthers offseason. My host today and guest, he is a former pro scout for the Eagles, now host of the 3 and Out podcast on the Volume. Let's welcome to the podcast, John Middlekauff. John, how are you?
Hey, pretty good. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. It's so good to have you on. Thanks again for joining me. Let's get right into it. To start, briefly, take me behind the scenes and our listeners, just how you got kind of started doing what you do now. I mean, graduated from Cal Poly in 2008. You were on their staff to start. Then you grad assistant at Fresno State. Eventually, 3 years in Philadelphia with the Eagles as a scout, and then you went into the writing business, wrote for the Raiders, 49ers, for The Athletic, and then obviously now you're with the podcast full-time doing that on the Volume with 3 and Out. And obviously I skipped some steps, I know, in between there, but kind of how did you get to where you're on now, just kind of for the audience who may not be as familiar with your show?
Yeah, when I started working in football, I didn't know where it was going to go or what was going to lead to. And when Chip Kelly came in with the Eagles after Andy got fired, and my contract didn't get renewed, I had lived in Philly for a couple of years. So when I moved back to the Northern California, I did the West Coast for us my third year.
Yeah.
And then I wasn't, you look at a lot of these people's bios, they bounce around the country. And I didn't think I was willing to do that. And it's not like I had, I was in my late 20s. I didn't know that many people in the NFL beside the people I had worked with. So I just kind of started. I had some buddies. I had a good buddy that was doing Bay Area radio. I knew some people doing local TV. And I just kind of transitioned and started doing TV and radio hits, and it just kind of organically grew. And then the podcast business, same thing. I got out of radio in like 2016 and just kind of started on the ground floor, and pretty early on realized the power of, the medium and where the world was going and how connected we are to our phones. And this nowhere near what we even are today.
Yeah.
And it just kind of grew and grew, and then met Colin through, I think we had some mutual connections, but I think he first reached out maybe on Twitter back in like 2014 maybe, and I started going on his ESPN radio show, and then that just kind of obviously organically grew to a podcast. And then now we're sitting here.
Yeah. Well, let's get into the Panther side of things. I listen to 3 and Out. I am a subscriber, so I know kind of your views on Bryce Young and the Panthers. I'll try not to go too scorched earth, hopefully, on your takes today. But thoughts on Bryce Young coming out of Alabama initially, and then I guess part one and part two, as you may have alluded to the other day on one of your episodes, have your views of him now changed in 1 year of pro football, or is it more you think he can still be a successful quarterback?
Well, like many, I liked him a lot. I mean, you go back to Alabama, I guess it would have been a sophomore year when they beat Georgia in the ACC championship, and then he lost 2 receivers, one in that game, and then another one I think in the playoff game. So by the time he played him in the national championship game, he was playing with a bunch of random receivers that by the next year weren't even on the team. And I remember, obviously, he was good. If I remember correctly, in the ACC championship game, he was excellent. And obviously, he was a star that season. But in that game, I remember watching him just get peppered and just keep getting up. And it was like, I love this guy. And just his pocket presence. I liked him a lot. I would have drafted him number 1 over CJ as a prospect. The thing that was so alarming to me was obviously Carolina's team was really bad last year.
Sure.
Right? Bill Walsh could have been the head coach, and they wouldn't have won 7. It would have been very difficult.
Yeah.
But when you see him on a field at his size in the NFL, and obviously in the SEC, they're, the most NFL players, it didn't feel as dramatic, even though he looked small in college. Even Panther fans would have to agree. He looks really, really small, and he is not a Kyler Murray athlete, right? His game, he's a pocket passing quarterback. And not that I change my tune hardcore just because he had a rough rookie year. It's, to me, the alarm bells went off with the size. And it's just, when has a player of his size and stature, it's not like he has some huge arm who can't really move. He's not like a Jared Goff, but he is not some mobile quarterback. And you just start going, how is this going to work? And then you factor in just the turmoil the organization has had. It's just an uphill battle. But I do think the size, it's very difficult. Kyler Murray, for example, is much more physically gifted than Bryce, right? Way faster, way thicker, way stronger arm. And it's hard for him. And a
Yeah.
lot of his great plays come kind of scrambling around off script, which is cool. But that, to win in the NFL, you have to consistently win from the pocket. I would say Cam was a little bit of an outlier in the way he played, but he also is one of the biggest physical freaks in the history of the league.
Mhm.
Right. So, and he's the opposite of Bryce.
Right.
He was 6'5", 6'6", was great speed, natural runner, huge arm, inaccurate, but his physical skills before his body fell apart were incredible. And I just, when your team's not very good, it's just very, very difficult. So I'm very, very concerned. And it starts with the body, because you guys are a good example. If you've been watching the Panthers for a long time, like your best players have been like blue chip size guys, right? Cam, Kuechly. That's just the way typically in the NFL, full of big, big guys. Now, you don't have to be huge to play quarterback, but I think we all would agree it is an uphill battle when you weigh. I don't count what he weighed into the combine. I think his natural weight's probably 185, 190. And maybe that will change as he gets a little older and lifts. And at that height, it's just tough. And when you factor in the talent on their team, even with a draft and an off season relative to a lot of the team, I mean, them and the Patriots are the only team, they're not even favored in a game. Now
Yeah.
it's May, but I do think that's reflective, right, of their roster's not very good.
Yeah.
Which is not his fault. He has nothing. He can't control
Sure.
that, but
Right.
that is his team. That's the team he goes to.
Yeah, and we'll get into the schedule right at the end, since schedule release was just yesterday. I know we only have you for a limited time. I mean, for just kind of your review, since I know you may not be as familiar with the Panthers kind of relatively long term. I mean, this offseason, obviously, we boosted the O-line, brought in some weapons for Bryce, traded for Deontay Johnson, that sort of thing. But listen, this team has not made the playoffs since 2017. We have never had back-to-back winning seasons since the inception of 1995. Played in 2 Super Bowls, lost both, as everyone knows. And then since Tepper's bought the team in 2018, we are on our 7th head coach, if you count interims as well.
Yeah.
And so, big picture, what does success kind of look like for the Panthers, not only in 2024, but beyond, in your opinion?
Well, I'd say first and foremost is for him to be good, right? Just where you watch him this year and you go, okay, we might have something. Because based on last year, you would not say that. Again, your career's not made in a year, especially a
Right.
rookie season on a bad team. But last year, would you agree, was a disaster?
Yeah. Well, I would also say, well, and I know Trevor Lawrence is 6'5", 6'6", so I know the height is different, and that's what Bryce is going to be constantly dinged about. But I would argue, while Urban Meyer and Frank Reich are 2 different people, I would argue, that's a comparison of, like, Trevor Lawrence had to deal with Urban Meyer, and that was a kind of a redshirt season as a rookie, and that this is kind of Bryce as well. Last year, he was not set up to success. So I think this year with Canales, new coach, new system, year 2, as Colin likes to say, Thanksgiving of year 2, well, do you kind of push that back to maybe year 3, simply because, like Trevor Lawrence, Bryce was not set up to succeed in year 1. So last year was kind of a redshirt season, if you will.
Yeah, and on Colin's thing, the Thanksgiving with year 2, when Trey Lance is an all-time outlier because they found Purdy, because of what they gave up for Bryce. To me, he's on scholarship for 3 years. He gets
Yeah.
this year and next year, right, to prove, because of the Bears have their second round pick this upcoming draft, right?
Yeah, correct.
So it's, the amount that they gave up, which if they had hit the quarterback, like if CJ Stroud, they had drafted him instead and he had just done and the Panthers won 8 games, we wouldn't even talk about the draft. But when you don't play well, and I'm with you, the difference of Trevor Lawrence is, who hasn't lived up to the hype, but he was a way better. Like, if they were in the same draft, Trevor Lawrence would have been picked ahead of him.
Mhm.
Like the gap in prospects. But I'm with you. That's the best part about sports with young players is your story's not written in one season. You get Canales, who just had success with a smaller quarterback. Now Baker's taller than Bryce, but similar stories, right? In the sense of a lot of negativity coming into the season. A lot of people didn't believe, and then he proved them wrong. I'm with you. They added Dante Johnson. They added the South Carolina wide receiver. So they should definitely have more explosive weapons. But he did, Baker got to inherit Mike Evans, who's probably a Hall of Famer, and Godwin is pretty damn good. So it's, that's pretty good weapons. We'll see, how when the Steelers want to trade you a wide receiver, usually even though Dante Johnson's a good player, but clearly something's a little off there. And rookie wide receivers, you just never know, even though a lot of people is it Leggett? Is that how you say the last name?
Leggett is apparently how
Le-
you say it. Leggett.
Leggett, yeah. I mean, clearly a lot of people were high on him, and he was going to go somewhere between probably 25 and 35. He's a really good player. But sometimes rookie wide receivers, even if he becomes like a 5-time Pro Bowler, you just never know right away. And the other thing is, for example, once they fired Urban Meyer, they got Doug Peterson, who had been a head coach, who had won a Super Bowl, who just, we'll find out if Doug's like some all-time great coach or not, but he knows what he's doing. Like he's an NFL head coach. Canales is kind of a lifetime position coach. It took him a long time. Seems like a likable guy. I mean, I'm not anti the guy, but I say this all the time with first-time head coach. You just never know. It's the gap between calling plays. Mike McDonald was by far the best coordinator, non-head coach, offense or defense last year. Him and Ben Johnson with the Lions, who went back. And it's like everyone thinks, oh, keep an eye on Seattle. Well, what if he is just overwhelmed? You just never know. It's hard.
Yeah.
And the other thing, and you brought up his name, Tepper, from a business standpoint, obviously he's like an all-time great businessman, genius at his field, the amount of money he made, he's a killer. But as an NFL owner, there's no disputing that his just inability to stay out of the way, and football is not trading stocks or construction, or like your opinions obviously matter when you want to insert them because you're the boss, but you need to just hire people and let them cook because you know nothing about football.
Yeah.
Right. Because most fans don't. It's such a, intricate, detailed, just foreign language to even if you own a team. Right. So I think that, and let's face it, you hire a first-time GM, even though he's a former player and been doing personnel for a while, and a first-time head coach. What Tepper, it's not like he has a coach or a GM that can even push back. It's a tough position for them. So it's going to come down to, can he just kind of chill a little bit? And it doesn't really feel like his personality, right? Where better than me, but it did feel like Jerry Richardson, who was a former player, when he hired someone, he might obviously get involved with a big contract or whatever, but he's not telling them plays and some of these stories that have come out about Tepper that, let's face it, I think sometimes these stories you never quite know. I think they're all pretty believable, right? Like, do most people in Carolina land, they're not pushing back against the David Tepper stuff.
Yeah, it depends on who you talk to, I'd say, but yeah, it just depends on who you talk to.
And
But
I know people that have been there, and they said, yeah, it's pretty crazy because he's just so involved. And
yeah,
there's something about, I have no problem like when you're giving your opinion on which quarterback to take. Josh Harris, that's not that weird. Like the draft process with a high pick, totally understand. Not that if the guy's going to be a great player or not, but I think we should go with that's normal. But when you're giving coaches plays and just always around them, it is very difficult to operate.
yeah. Let's circle back to the defense really quick before we get into the schedule and some your predictions. I'll get you out of here. Ejiro Evero is the Panthers' second-year defensive coordinator. Rare feat. The Panthers brought back every single coach on his staff, obviously including Evero, and that's rare in the NFL. And so personally, and I'm not saying this just as a Panthers podcast guy, but also I follow the team, since their inception in 95. They can be a top 12 defense this year. I think a lot of people might be sleeping on the Panthers from the defensive perspective. Yes, Brian Burns is gone, but you bring in guys like Clowney, DJ One, who played across Danielle Hunter in Minnesota got 8 sacks last year, and then Josie Jewell from the Broncos are just a few names that the Panthers brought in.
He's a
And
good
then the
player.
guy that seems to get confused with Patrick Surtain, J.C. Horn, both of them were in the same draft class. But as we know with Horn, he's just got to stay on the field. He's got to stay healthy. He is a shutdown corner when he stays healthy. That's not a fact. That's not an opinion. That's a fact if he stays healthy. And so that's just a few of the, and then obviously Derek Brown, who I would argue is now probably top 2 defensive tackle in the league with Eric Donald retired now. Maybe top 4 with Aaron Donald retired. So kind of what your
Him,
thoughts on the
Simmons.
defense?
Yeah, I mean it's a short list. He's a really good player.
Yeah.
I think. Well, 2 years ago when they fired, who was your coach? They fired before
So we,
Frank.
so, so we had the Matt Rule era.
Oh yeah. So when they fired Rule early in the season, was after the Niner game or maybe a week
It
later.
was right after the Niner game, and then Steve Wilkes, who ironically would then become the Niners defensive coordinator later on. He was the interim head coach down the stretch. He won 6 out of their last 8 games, and it was
And you guys were good. And you guys were good on defense with a lot of similar personnel. So
correct.
I think, yeah, defensively, Ajiro a couple years ago was viewed as one of the up and coming defensive coordinators. I'm sure they paid him a lot of money. Like that's a smart move, and especially when you're hiring a guy, not a big name head coach, it's easier to dictate like, hey, we want to keep this guy, and it's easy for him to just kind of capitulate to those demands. So yeah, I think 100% they could be solid on defense. They have a new, management. I think the way they handled the Burn situation makes me scratch my head a little bit because I think looking back, right, the Bears trade was simply Poles said, listen, instead of giving us all the ones, we want one of these 3 players,
Correct.
Brown, Burns, and DJ.
Yep.
And there's no way looking back, even before they were offered pick from the Rams, they should have just included Burns if they were kind of on the fence whether he was a long-term guy. Kept DJ Moore, who was under contract and one of your guys' best players,
Yep.
for a rookie quarterback, right? Because the trade was to get that was a botched move, clearly.
Mm-hmm.
Even if you remove what else they could have got from, for him from other teams,
yeah,
that's a redo that they should have done. They should have said Derek Brown's off limits, and you can have the pass rusher because the wide receiver, who by all accounts, good guy, obviously a really dynamic player who was under a team friendly deal, would have been awesome for the rookie quarterback. And that probably stunted, the whole operation. Maybe Bryce looks a little better because the best part about DJ is like you can throw quick screens. You can just throw like layup plays to him. He's kind of like a little different version of Deebo Samuel, who's very quarterback friendly.
Yeah.
And the Burn situation was clearly just, I'm not putting it on Dan Morgan. It was botched from a couple years ago when they were on the fence. Anytime you're on the fence with a player and you get offered a way to pivot off them for something else that you really want, that would have been what they wanted to do. But I'm with you. I do think you got to be careful about, J.C. Horn type guys who are really, really talented, but just never stay healthy. And they're the type guys that just drive a fan base nuts. I mean, I'm rooting for the guy to stay on the field, but after a while they show you, this is clearly a big year for him, but because they picked up his 5th year option, right? So, contract year, but it hasn't been anything like lack of desire when he just legitimately gets injured. And sometimes skill guys at wide receiver or at DB for whatever reason, you'd know the injuries better than me, but sometimes it's just kind of unlucky. But sometimes injury prone guys, sometimes it can be an unfair term. They're just more likely to get random injuries, even if it's out of their control. So I'm with you. Their defense definitely could be better. Offense, it just comes back to the quarterback. Like, can he be a top like 17, 18 guy? Because if he is, then you'd be pretty happy. And the division, it's weird. Like, I don't feel great about just locking Atlanta in, but it is a pretty solid division, right? Atlanta's got a lot of talent. Now Cousins stabilizes. Tampa clearly has a lot of talent. All these guys, the core of their team, all play with Brady, and they won a lot of games. And the Saints, went 9-8, and for a lot of the year, their offense was terrible. So if Kubiak and their offense is just better, they might be a 9-10 win team, but look a lot better. So the division, while it might not have like the high end of like the Lions, Packers, Rams, Niners, it could just be a very, very competitive division. So the 6 games are just against teams. I mean, all 3 teams could win anywhere from 8 to 10 games, right?
Right. Exactly. Yeah, I was going to get to that in a second. Yeah, I mean, and then Derek Brown, as we mentioned earlier, I mean, I think some of that you mentioned with Tepper earlier, the loyalty is finally starting to turn around. Derek Brown did sign his extension with the Panthers earlier this offseason. And then we saw, as you mentioned, Brian Burns now traded to the Giants, DJ Moore, as we mentioned, to the Bears, and then obviously McCaffrey a few years back now after to the 49ers. And it seems like from the Panthers fan base, right, we're getting these great players and then we're just trading them away. And it's like we can't keep our homegrown talent. So I think that Derek Brown contract is kind of the first step in this new regime, as you said, to let's quit letting our homegrown talent go out the door. Let's actually keep them here and build around these core pieces. So I think that's first step that did Morgan.
The McCaffrey trade, for as great as he's been with the Niners, wasn't crazy. Like it's easy to look back and be, what the hell were you thinking? He was injured a bunch. He was making a ton of money. And how often can you ever trade a running back for a second, third, fourth round pick? I mean, they got a ton. That to me is by far the least crazy, and most teams in that position would have done the same thing.
Yeah.
Like I view that in a different category. Now, it hasn't aged as well because he went to, the second best team in the league for the last 2 years, and he's been
healthy.
Trent Williams is technically their best player, but he's their most important.
He hasn't missed a game.
Healthy,
he's been healthy.
Yeah, and we knew when McCaffrey was on the field. I remember when they took him 8th, and I was wrong on McCaffrey. I was like, he's probably going to end up more like a Julian Edelman, more of a slot receiver than a running back, and he was just immediately a star.
Yeah.
But then the injuries really derailed his career, and like you said, he's been healthy. Maybe that time gave him change his body a little bit, change his lifting habits, because he's a pretty tightly wound guy. But he went to a team and a coach that just utilizes him like he's Marshall Faulk or something.
Exactly. Let's get into the schedule. A few predictions. I'll get you out of here. So the schedule release was obviously yesterday, and the team's social media accounts, obviously they get to do their thing. This is kind of their Super Bowl. Panthers get the lovely distinction, which I think is a really good thing, of being the only team without primetime games. We play a last place schedule. And so we have teams like the Bears coming in, the Bengals, who both finished last place, and then we face the AFC West. So Chiefs, Chargers are the two that we get at home. And then NFC East, Dallas at home, Giants is the big Germany game. So my question to you is, obviously we're not going to go through the schedule. How do you feel like the Panther players are feeling? You're a scout, so you've at least been in the building. Do you think the Panther players are feeling kind of disrespected, or are they feeling motivated to prove the league wrong? That, hey, this flex schedule is going to come out later on, and you're going to see us on primetime. Or is it kind of one of those things that players look at it like, well, we're done by mid-afternoon every day, and we get to kind of chill for the rest of the day. Get games at 1:00, routine's the same every week. We have no Thursday night game either. So except for the Germany game specifically at 9:30 a.m. in November, 1:00 games for the Panthers every week.
It's your only standalone game. Yeah. When you're terrible, you just don't, last year, I think I heard a stat recently that CJ Stroud and the Texans, every one of their games, beside the last game, they got flexed because it was for the division championship.
Right.
Was the morning, for us on the West Coast, 10 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. Every single one of their games. Well, they had the number 2 pick the year before. Sure. So when you're bad, it's part of the deal. I think it's less about respect and disrespect. Like the Panthers players, just like the coaches, just need to prove like it's the NFL. We need to go to training camp, and we got to try to. How many games you guys win last year?
2. Not good.
Yeah, I mean, try to triple that, right? I mean, which would be a huge success if you went 6-11 and showed some progress. So it's actually easier to not have any night games or any Monday night games, no Thursday games.
I agree. I agree.
So, but you also in the NFL, this is not like the NBA where they would put the Lakers and Warriors. Like the NFL, if you're good, they'll put you on primetime games.
Sure.
Right? It's proven that.
Or we had Cam. We were on there a lot with Cam, obviously, but he was also
100% Sunday night games, Monday night games. The NFL is not based on market size to get the primetime games. It's based on winning. Like the Cowboys get a lot and the Niners get a lot, but they have been winning 12, 13 games the last couple of years, right? The Jets are somewhat of an outlier, but they got Aaron freaking Rodgers. If Aaron Rodgers was on the Panthers, you guys would have a couple games. So yeah, I don't think that matters at all. I think the 100% key is just, can we be a lot better than we were last year? Because for the most part, you watched a lot more snaps of it than me, especially as the season went on. It was a really, really hard
It was
watch.
not good. So do you think this season is about wins and losses for the Panthers, or is it about simply just is Bryce our guy moving forward and sustaining him and getting him looking like a franchise quarterback?
Well, I think they go hand in hand. If he's your guy and he's takes a big step, you're just going to win more games.
Yeah,
You might not win 8,
right.
but you can win 5. And if you win 5, like bad teams, there's obviously the 1 or 2 win teams usually are terrible,
Right.
but a lot of 5 or 6 win teams could go a bounce here, a bounce there, and we win 8 or 9.
Yeah.
So it means you're in a lot more games, especially like you said, if your defense is good. So I think that would be the key. Like, hey, can we double or triple this thing, get to 5 or 6? And that would mean, hey, are we in, you know, of the 11 losses, are 5 of those losses, we're in a tight game in the fourth quarter, half of those against the Atlantas and the Tampas. That would feel pretty good. And from your standpoint, it'd be a lot more watchable, right?
Yeah. Last two, I'll get you out of here. And this is more just a caveat with the division. You can respond to this first if you want. I mean, I've had people on my podcast who, guys, I had Anish Shroff, radio voice of the Panthers. You know, he talked about alignment is the key this year between Tepper, between Canales and Dan Morgan, you know, and that just didn't exist with the Panthers over the last, 3, 4, 5, 6 years. And so some of my guests that have come on, they've come out and said, listen, I don't think the Panthers are going to win the division outright. I don't think that's a fair assessment. However, you look at our division, as we talked about earlier, Canales knows Tampa Bay. He was just there. Sure, there's going to be some things changed up on game day and everything else with codes and stuff, but Canales knows Tampa Bay. New Orleans' roster is getting older. They still have Dennis Allen as head coach, which we both, I think, agree on that on his
Yeah.
on his tenure there. Michael Thomas no longer there. Kamara, another age up in year. And then Falcons, we mentioned earlier, Cousins coming off a torn Achilles. The weapons are great, but their defense is very underwhelming. So it leaves a lot to be desired, in my opinion. So not saying the Panthers are going to win the division or anything, but I think if they could get out to a fast start, they could have as good a chance as anybody. So, we'll see what happens there.
Yeah, don't disagree with you there. I mean, I think I'm not sold on Atlanta by any means. And even the weapons, like Bijan's a really talented player and Drake London solid. Like Kyle Pitts, he gets lumped in there. I got to see a little more before we start acting like he's sweet. I'm with you on the Tampa connection, but we would all have to agree that Tampa, top to bottom, has a lot of talent at a lot of different positions,
Right.
right? And
Yes.
high end impact Pro Bowl level guys. I'm probably going to pick them to win the division. Now the kicker with them is like losing Canales, who was on the same page with Baker. Does Baker play like he did last year or take a step back? That would be a problem.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I definitely think they could, and that's where all of a sudden you go from 2 to 5. You win some of those divisional games that you didn't last year. And yeah, that division feels, I mean, that would be one of the crazier stories because
I
to
mean, it
win the
would be Houston
division,
Texans of last year, correct? That's what it would be.
yeah. And
So
they benefited, the Jags were kind of in shambles. Colts lost the quarterback.
Richardson,
Titans
yep.
were awful.
Yeah.
But who knows? Maybe the Saints and Atlanta are 6-7 win teams.
If we come close to winning the division or we have a miraculous turnaround of some sort, I'll have to have you back on in the future. We'll talk about that. What is your 2024 bold prediction for the Panthers? It can be a team specific or it can be individual player. What's your bold prediction for this team this year?
That's a good question. I think a lot of people are going to pick you guys to win, be like the same. Most people are going to, when we talk about worst teams in the league, you win 4 games all of a sudden. I mean, you guys were pretty bad a couple years ago when you traded. You guys were drafting 9th, right?
Yep. Yep.
And that season was you guys, was it Tampa with 2 weeks to go? You had a chance and they beat you
against Brady and Tampa. Yep. JC Horn was out, and then Mike Evans toasted CJ Henderson most of that game.
Yeah, and I remember he caught this touchdown down the left corner. I remember watching that game because there was a hype going in. If the Panthers win this game, you guys were kind of rolling.
Yep.
You can be a bad like draft in the top 10 and have a fun second half of the season,
Yep.
So it's that to me would be I'm not confident in saying that, but it's definitely you've sold me a little bit. They've added some talent. And to me, your greatest strength is all the different question marks with the division.
Yeah.
And your new head coach was also a subtraction to the team that, I I mean, the Tampa didn't just win the division for however many straight years in a row. They also won a playoff game pretty easily, and they went toe to toe with the Lions. Like they were those two playoff games for them were pretty impressive. So
Yeah.
I would put them on a different level, but I wouldn't just bet my life savings on that you guys are going to finish last in the division. I'll say that.
Yeah. So as you head out the door, is there any topic that you want to hit on really quick from a Panthers perspective? Obviously, I know your podcast may not, talk about the Panthers quite as much, but from a standpoint of, hey, from my perspective, Panther fans, here's something that I would be watching for as well this year. Something that maybe we're not talking about here, or something that maybe you heard from a scout or somebody you might know, but that's plugged in with the Carolinas, something to watch out for.
I actually think from a fan base, knowing every single week exactly what time your team's playing at, and it's the same time, pretty easy to live your life if you're a diehard football fan.
Yeah.
Sometimes like, well, I can't do this because they're playing. You never even have to think about that. If you got family stuff Monday night, if you got to do something, you never, well, my team's playing. That's actually, because it probably won't last that long. Eventually you'll be solid again and get some of those games. So that's actually a good place to be as a football fan.
Yeah. Well, as I said at the top, my guest today is John Middlekauff, host of the 3 and Out podcast on the Volume. John, all the best to you. Thanks for coming on the podcast, and we'll talk to you down the road.
Thanks a lot, Ryan. Have a good one.
And that'll wrap up this edition of Inside the Vault, episode number 38. Rate, review, and subscribe wherever you get your podcast. We will see you next time.